There is a question that appears again and again in political debates, intelligence briefings, and media headlines around the world. At first glance, it sounds straightforward. When American leaders warn that another country is approaching the ability to build a nuclear weapon, what exactly does that mean? Because if you begin tracing these warnings over the past several decades, something strange emerges. The United States has repeatedly told the public that a particular country is only months away from developing a nuclear bomb. Sometimes the timeline is 6 months, sometimes it is a year, sometimes officials say the moment is just around the corner, and yet somehow the corner never quite arrives. The deadline shifts, the clock resets, the same warning returns again and again, applied to different countries, but always carrying the same sense of urgency. At that point, the natural reaction is to assume intelligence mistakes are being made. Perhaps analysts misinterpret evidence. Perhaps new information changes the assessment. One or two errors might be explained that way. But when the same pattern appears across decades, across administrations, and across multiple geopolitical crises, the explanation becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. When something repeats often enough, it begins to look less like a mistake and more like a system. And that leads us to a deeper and far more uncomfortable question. What if the nuclear threat narrative is not only a response to real dangers in the world? What if it also serves a political and strategic function that goes far beyond any individual crisis? The argument I want to explore today is simple but provocative. Great powers often rely on the language of existential threats to maintain political unity at home and legitimacy abroad. Nuclear weapons, because of their uniquely terrifying destructive power, provide the most powerful narrative tool available for this purpose. The fear of nuclear annihilation creates urgency, and urgency generates political momentum for policies that might otherwise face resistance. To evaluate this argument seriously, we need to examine it from two perspectives. The first is historical. We can look at how powerful civilizations in the past behaved when they faced similar structural challenges. The second is strategic. We can ask why rational political leaders might find it advantageous to frame international problems in this particular way. Let us begin with history because the pattern stretches back far longer than modern nuclear politics. More than 2,000 years ago, the dominant power of the Mediterranean world was the Roman Republic. Around 200 BCE, Rome had just survived one of the most dangerous conflicts in its history, the Second Punic War against Carthage. During that war, the Carthaginian general Hannibal led an army across the Alps with war elephants and nearly destroyed Rome itself. The conflict traumatized Roman society. Entire armies were wiped out. Rome's survival hung by a thread for years. Eventually, however, Rome won. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was forced into a humiliating peace treaty that stripped it of military power and severely weakened its economy. For decades afterward, Carthage posed very little real threat to Rome. It was a diminished state struggling simply to recover from the devastation of war. Yet inside Roman politics, something remarkable began to happen. Roman leaders repeatedly warned that Carthage remained a danger. They claimed that the city was quietly rebuilding its strength and that if Rome did not act, it might one day face another catastrophic war. One Roman senator in particular became famous for repeating this warning, Cato the Elder. At the end of nearly every speech he delivered in the Roman Senate, regardless of the topic under discussion, Cato concluded with the same phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." It did not matter whether the Senate was debating agriculture, taxation, or trade. Cato always returned to the same message. Why would a sophisticated politician repeat such a statement so relentlessly? Because Cato understood something fundamental about political psychology. Fear has the power to unify a society in ways that ordinary politics cannot. When a population believes its survival is at stake, internal disagreements fade into the background. Political resistance weakens. Leaders gain greater freedom to mobilize resources and pursue ambitious goals. Eventually, after years of warnings and repeated messaging, Rome launched the Third Punic War. Carthage was defeated completely. The city was burned to the ground. Its population was killed or enslaved. One of the greatest civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean simply disappeared from history. Many historians today believe Carthage no longer posed a meaningful threat to Rome by that point, but whether the threat was real or exaggerated ultimately mattered less than the political narrative that had taken hold within Roman society. Now fast forward more than 2,000 years to the early 21st century. In 2003, the United States prepared to invade Iraq. The central argument presented to the American public and to the international community was that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Officials warned that Saddam Hussein's government was pursuing nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs that posed an imminent threat. The language used to describe these dangers was urgent and vivid. Images of mushroom clouds were invoked. Intelligence reports were cited with apparent certainty. The result was a surge of political support for military action. The invasion took place. The Iraqi government was removed from power. Yet the weapons programs described in such detail were never found in the form originally presented. Years of investigations revealed that the intelligence picture had been far more uncertain than the public narrative suggested. Analysts and historians continue to debate how this happened. Some argue that intelligence agencies made analytical mistakes. Others argue that political leaders selectively emphasized the most alarming interpretations of ambiguous evidence. Most likely, the outcome resulted from a combination of bureaucratic incentives, political pressure, and genuine uncertainty. What matters most for our purposes, however, is the role that the nuclear threat narrative played in shaping political decision-making. Without the perception of an imminent weapons threat, it would have been extremely difficult to build the domestic and international support necessary for such a large-scale military intervention. When we place these two examples side by side, ancient Rome and modern America, we begin to see a recurring pattern. As states grow powerful and expand their influence beyond their borders, they develop large military establishments and complex alliance networks. Maintaining these systems requires public support, financial resources, and political legitimacy. External threats provide a powerful justification for sustaining those commitments. This brings us to the strategic logic behind the nuclear threat narrative. Imagine you are the leader of a global superpower. Your country maintains military bases across multiple continents. It leads alliances that span the globe. Its defense institutions employ millions of people and command enormous budgets. Over time, however, the domestic public begins asking difficult questions. Why are so many resources devoted to overseas commitments? Could that money be spent improving infrastructure, healthcare, or education at home? Does maintaining global military dominance actually benefit ordinary citizens? At that moment, you face a profound political challenge. Explaining the complexities of global strategy to the public is difficult. It requires patience, nuance, and trust in institutions that may already be declining. There is, however, another option. Highlight a clear and immediate threat that makes the stakes of global engagement obvious. Nuclear weapons serve this purpose perfectly. The possibility that an adversary might acquire them evokes an almost primal fear. Nuclear weapons symbolize total destruction. They collapse complex geopolitical questions into a single, emotionally powerful narrative. From the perspective of political strategy, this makes the nuclear threat narrative an extremely effective tool. It aligns public opinion behind policies that might otherwise appear controversial. It strengthens support for military spending. It reinforces alliances and international commitments. And it raises the political cost of dissent, because anyone who questions the narrative risks being portrayed as naive about national security. Over time, this process can become self-reinforcing. Intelligence agencies may feel pressure to highlight worst-case scenarios rather than uncertain evidence. Politicians repeat the warnings because doing so carries little political risk. Media organizations amplify the message because stories about existential danger attract attention. Eventually, the narrative becomes so familiar that it begins to feel like common sense rather than a constructed political argument. When we return to the original question, why nuclear threat warnings appear so consistently in the politics of great powers, the answer may therefore be structural rather than accidental. Powerful states require narratives that justify their global role. Nuclear threats provide the most compelling narrative available, but history also offers a cautionary lesson. When threat narratives drift too far from reality, they can lead to strategic overreach. Fear can mobilize societies quickly, but it can also push them into conflicts that drain resources and weaken long-term stability. Rome's endless wars eventually undermined the republic it sought to protect. 2 decades of conflict in the Middle East left the United States more politically divided and strategically strained than before. So the next time you hear a warning that a particular country is only months away from developing nuclear weapons, it is important to approach the claim with both seriousness and skepticism. The threat may indeed be real, but understanding the political and strategic role that such narratives play is essential to understanding how great powers behave. Because the recurring nuclear countdown is not simply a story about bombs, it is a story about fear, about power, and about the political systems that depend on both.